Some men came home from the jungles of Vietnam, but the war never quite left their living rooms. Their boots stayed by the door. Their meals came from cans. Their beds were the floor. For them, these weren't eccentricities. They were the echoes of a world that asked everything and offered no clear way back. Them eccentricities, they were the echoes of a world that asked everything and offered no clear way back. You don't stop hearing the rain when you come home. You just stop talking about it. Sergeant David L. Morris, 1st Cavalry, 1968. When I returned to the village, I still woke before dawn, listening for the helicopters. My wife said the war had ended, but the forest inside me had not. Nguyen Van Loc, People's Army of Vietnam. When the planes touched down and the jungle mud dried into the seams of their boots, many veterans stepped back onto American soil as if stepping into another planet. The war they had lived was not the war the world wanted to remember. Some walked off the tarmac into silence, greeted by no parade, no banner, just the hum of a country that had already decided to look away. For those who fought in Vietnam, the act of taking off one's boots carried more than fatigue. It meant safety, a pause, an exhale. But in the bush, safety was temporary. Boots were armor against the unknown, against snakes, shrapnel, and the suddenness of ambush. When a man slept with his boots on, it wasn't out of habit. It was because to remove them meant to forget vigilance, and vigilance was life. When they came home, some veterans kept their boots near the bed. Others never took them off except to shower. Their families wondered why. "It's just comfortable that way," they'd say, or, "I don't know, it feels right." But beneath the words was memory, of foxholes that flooded at night, of being ready to run at the first crack of a twig, of learning that comfort was a luxury paid for in blood. In small towns, from Texas to Ohio, veterans could be found sleeping on the floor beside their beds. They'd spread a blanket across the hardwood and rest there instead. To outsiders it seemed strange, but to them a bed was softness that didn't feel earned, a space that separated them from the earth they had shared with brothers they'd lost. Sleeping on the floor felt honest. It was level, quiet, unpretentious, a soldier's rest. Some kept their pantries stocked with canned food long after the ration lines had blurred into memory. The metallic clink of a tin can, the smell of condensed meat, these were reminders of a kind of certainty. In the jungle, canned food was survival, simple, predictable, indestructible. Back home, it was a token against the chaos of memory, a way of keeping control. And then there was the rain. Vietnam was rain, relentless, heavy, constant. Men learned to sleep through it, talk through it, march through it. When they came home and the storms rolled across the Midwest or the Gulf, some would find themselves standing on their porches, just watching. The smell of wet earth could transport them instantly. Some would close their eyes and see not their backyards, but the drenched, steaming green of the Mekong Delta. America in the late 1960s was a nation divided by a war that few understood and fewer wished to remember. For the veteran, coming home meant entering a silence deeper than the jungle ever was. Some were called heroes, others were met with suspicion. Airports, once the gateway to home, became corridors of confusion. Many arrived alone. One veteran remembered stepping off the plane in San Francisco still wearing his fatigues. I walked into a restroom and changed into a shirt I bought in Saigon. I left the uniform in the trash can. It felt like shedding a skin. For others, it was the opposite. They kept the uniform hung neatly in the closet, pressed and ready, as if one day they might be called again. In the towns they returned to, the war wasn't spoken of much. Families wanted to move forward. Neighbors avoided the subject. For those who had lived day by day with death, that silence could feel unbearable. The habits they kept, sleeping light, eating fast, scanning rooftops, flinching at fireworks, were their language. It was how they spoke to themselves about things that couldn't be said out loud. On the other side of the world, Vietnamese veterans carried their own silent rituals. Some still walked barefoot along the edge of rice paddies, scanning for shapes in the dirt. Others kept their old canteens, refilling them each morning as if preparing for another march through the mountains. Nguyen Vinh Loc, who fought near Khe San, described his habit of boiling tea in the same battered pot he used in the field. "The handle is burned," he said, "but it still holds water. It reminds me that I still hold life." Both sides, American and Vietnamese, were bound by a strange brotherhood of endurance. They had looked at the same sky through the same humid air, both believing they were defending something sacred. When the shooting stopped, each carried home not victory or defeat, but an inheritance of memory that refused to fade. For American veterans, this inheritance took the form of rituals, quiet, often misunderstood. Some collected old MREs and stowed them in garages. Some built gardens because tending to the soil was a way of undoing destruction. Some refused to take off their boots until they had completed their day's work, a gesture of discipline, of unfinished duty. The years rolled forward, and the war began to live more in photographs than in flesh. But for those who had served, the past was not a chapter to be closed. It was a companion that aged alongside them. Veterans' reunions in small American towns became their own form of therapy. They didn't need to explain why certain nights they slept in the recliner instead of the bed, or why the sound of helicopters in a movie made them step outside for air. Among each other, they could simply exist, boots on, coffee black, jokes dry as dust. One man said he never took off his boots at home because the floor is not safe until I check it. He smiled when he said it, but behind the smile was truth. Safety for a soldier was not a place, but a process, one you could never quite complete. For their families, these rituals were both mysterious and tender. Wives washed boots that never seemed to stay clean. Children grew up learning not to wake their fathers too suddenly. And in time, they came to understand. These weren't symptoms. They were memorials in motion. Gestures of love for the men who didn't come back. Time passed differently for those who came home from Vietnam. The world changed around them. Disco lights replaced flares. New wars were fought on television screens, and the uniforms of a new generation bore desert dust instead of red clay. But for many of the men who'd walked the paddies and jungles, time never quite straightened out. The war followed them, not as noise, but as quiet routine. Some woke every morning before sunrise, as they had in country, even decades later. The first light through the kitchen window reminded them of the soft orange haze that used to settle over the tree line before a patrol. They'd pour coffee, black and steaming, and sit in silence while the rest of the world still slept. Others found solace in their gardens, neat rows of tomatoes and beans, disciplined as soldiers on parade. The soil, once foreign and hostile under their boots, became a place of rebirth. Every seed they pressed into the dirt was a small act of defiance against the destruction they'd seen. In every sprout, a whisper, life still grows. Some, even into their 60s and 70s, still kept the small radio by their bedside. They listened to static or late-night talk shows. In Vietnam, the radio was their link to command, to safety, to each other. Back home, that faint hum of distant voices was a reminder that they weren't entirely alone in the dark. Families adapted to these quiet patterns. A wife might wake to find her husband sitting on the floor beside the bed, boots on, head bowed. She'd cover him with a blanket without saying a word. A son might grow up learning that the sharp smell of gun oil in the garage wasn't something to question. It was a scent of his father's steadiness, his way of remembering control in a world that once offered none. Some veterans spoke of dreams that made them restless. Others didn't speak of them at all. But in daylight, the small gestures, a careful way of folding shirts, a refusal to waste food, the insistence on locking doors twice, all told the story. It was not fear. It was remembrance written into muscle and habit. In time, some of those who fought on opposite sides met again, not as enemies, but as survivors of the same storm. In the late 1980s and 90s, veterans began returning to Vietnam in small groups. They came to see the places that had shaped their youth, to face the ghosts that had never left. One American veteran, standing at the edge of what had once been a battlefield, met a Vietnamese farmer who was his age. They spoke through an interpreter, but soon the words didn't matter. The farmer's son brought tea, and they sat in the shade of a tree that had grown where craters once were. The veteran said later, "We didn't talk about who was right. We talked about the rain. We both remembered the rain." Vietnamese veterans, too, carried their own rituals. Many still gathered yearly to burn incense for the fallen, for comrades, and sometimes even for those they had fought against. One said, "When I burn the incense, the smoke rises without asking who it belongs to." There were American vets who sent back letters, photographs, and even prosthetic limbs for clinics in Hanoi and Da Nang. They did it quietly, not as penance, but as connection, an act of mending. In a small town in Iowa, a veteran who once fought near Hue began carving walking sticks and shipping them to veterans' homes in Vietnam. He said, "Wood remembers. If you shape it carefully, it forgives you." These gestures built invisible bridges, not of policy or politics, but of human endurance. Both nations aged. Both learned that memory, when shared, can be a form of healing. As the decades rolled on, the boots by the door gathered dust. Some men finally took them off. Others left them there even after they'd stopped wearing them. In a few homes, after a veteran passed away, their families kept the boots in place, a quiet monument to a life lived between worlds. At reunions, men who once slept in the mud laughed about how they couldn't sleep in soft hotel beds. "Give me a cot, or I'll end up on the floor anyway." The laughter carried warmth, not mockery, but recognition. There was pride, too, though it often came softened by humility. They had done what was asked of them, even when the country itself wasn't sure what that meant. And in their small habits, the careful folding of a flag, the way they stood for the anthem with straight backs and misted eyes, they taught younger generations what endurance really looked like. By the turn of the century, the war had become history. It lived in classrooms and documentaries, in fading photographs and granite names. But for those who had lived it, the lessons were still alive. Teachers invited veterans to speak in schools. Some came in uniform, others in old service caps. When asked about the war, they often didn't talk about politics or strategy. They talked about friendship, about loyalty, about what it meant to watch someone walk into danger for you and never see them again. Vietnamese veterans did the same in their villages. They spoke of survival, of rebuilding, of seeing former battlefields covered in green rice again. One said, "The land remembers, but it also forgives." There was a quiet beauty in that forgiveness. The veterans who never took off their boots weren't trapped by war. They were holding on to the only parts of it that still made sense: readiness, respect, and the memory of those who could not come home. The habits left behind by war are not weaknesses. They are stories written in motion, ways of carrying memory without words. A man who sleeps on the floor is not restless. He is remembering a night when he could not afford to dream. A pantry full of cans is not paranoia. It is a promise never to be hungry again. The boots by the door, worn but waiting, are not relics of fear. They are symbols of faith, that even when the world turns cold or uncertain, one must be ready to stand, to move, to protect what remains. In the end, some did take them off, others never did, but all carried within them a truth that outlasted the noise of battle, that endurance is its own kind of peace.